You are my glorious King. When I'm up and blessings abound, and your grace falls like rain. When your love and mercy surround, Lord, I will praise you again, my God, Redeemer and friend. When everything's right, I will praise you. In seasons of joy, I will sing, and even in trials, I'll still praise you, for you are my glorious King. Yes.
My light says I'm on. Now I'm on. Yep, there it is. All right, it's good to see everybody out this evening. Good to welcome anybody who's watching on the live stream tonight. Welcome to the Wednesday night Lost River Bible study. We're in the book of Exodus, and we'll be talking about the Red Sea crossing tonight in Exodus chapter 13 and 14. Before we get started this evening, let's go to God in a word of prayer. Our great and heavenly Father, we come before you humbled to know that you are a King, that you are the God who saves his people, who looks down upon us when there is no other salvation to be found, and sticks out your hand and rules for us and provides shelter and covering and a way of escape so that we may live ever with you and that we may learn to trust you and rely upon you and wait upon your word, that we may know that you rule in the hearts and in the kingdoms of men. We're so thankful that you've given us this opportunity to gather as your people and to open up your word and to see what it has for us and to understand. And we ask that you would give us wisdom and understanding that we may be able to do that this evening. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. If you would, open up your Bibles to Exodus chapter 13. Exodus chapter 13. We're going to pick up there. I'm going to say a few things from Exodus chapter 13 in the middle that we didn't cover. But before we get started on some of that, I'm going to start with some quick caveats because I feel like there's some important caveats that I want to make before we get too far into this night's proceedings. One of those is that a lot of the places that we're going to talk about in terms of where we're going in the Red Sea crossing and a lot of what's going to be unfolding in the next few class periods is there's going to be a lot of city locations, a lot of various locations that are given. And I'm not going to show you. The other guys can show you. Maybe I don't talk to Scott. Honestly, this is not one of the things that we talked about. Is if anybody has any really strong opinions about the route of the Exodus. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. I don't know. Maybe Jay has some really strong opinions. I mean, there are certainly people out there, scholars out there, who have really strong opinions on this, one way or the other, on all kinds of ranges. One of the things I would say just right off the top is that there are a lot of places that are just completely unknown to us this day. And there's probably a good reason for that. So the Israelites, as a large group, leaving. So let's think about the logistics of this with me. So you have a large group of people that previously were settled in the land of Egypt, and now they're leaving Egypt. Where are the places? They're not likely to stop at large population centers. Because if you're a big group of people and you go to where another big group of people are, what are they inherently going to view that as? These people are here to invade, right? So they avoid these large population centers. And so large population centers are typically where all the history's at. That's where we know where those places are, but we don't stop at a lot of those places. So there's not a lot of great geographical or historical, there's not a lot of evidence of where, okay, this place is here, that place is there. And we see that as we get further into the study here and ultimately the wilderness wanderings throughout the rest of the Pentateuch. The route that you choose, and again, the other guys can address this, is largely based on where you think Sinai is. So, and then there's a lot of people who have a lot of, and I'm sure we'll get into this later on, but a lot of people have a lot of ideas about where Sinai is, but where you think they went, you have to work backwards from where you think they ended up back into all these things and make the geography fit. And all kinds of people have promoted all kinds of things. And I would sit here and just say to you, There have been people who have literally dedicated their life's work to trying to figure this out, and the thought that I'm going to stand in here in a 45-minute class and break it down for you is not going to happen. So I'm going to tell you right now, I don't know. There's a lot of people who have studied this a lot and have strong opinions about it. I don't, and I wouldn't advocate for any individual Mount Sinai. I'll briefly allude to that a little bit more in just a second. Another thing that hasn't been brought up but does kind of come up here, some of the chronological issues that are going to come up in the passages we have tonight. There are two main positions out there. There's a late date and an early date, one about 14 something and one about 12 something for the Exodus. And both these dates have issues that are with them, and scholars will debate this just as much as they debate where Sinai is, and that leads to, well, which Pharaoh is this? And there are all kinds of reasons that we'll look into that. I'm not going to advocate for any one or the other, because again, people dedicate their whole life's work to trying to figure these things out. Here is some possible, and that's small for me, but it's me. Yeah, it's okay for you guys. So here are some possible ideas about routes of the Exodus and where, and obviously the pertinent part for us tonight is okay, well, where did they cross the Red Sea at? And was it the Red Sea or was it the Reed Sea and that whole business? And we're not going to do any of that. But other than to show you just a couple different things on here, you know, the red dashes are typically the routes that you would have, or the traditional routes for the Exodus with the traditional location of Sinai. You'll see the bottom kind of bluish arrow there for where traditional Sinai is. That's Jebel Musa. That is the location there. There's been a great deal of other thoughts that the Mount Sinai is located in Midian. That Midian extends over into Saudi Arabia, and there's an identified mountain over there about where my arrow points called Jebel Alaz. Midian also, in a lot of passages, there's a consistent idea that Mount Sinai is south of the Promised Land, that the Lord marches north. He comes from his south, and it's somewhere in a range of Midian. And so you kind of see all these different options there. Again, I have no idea, and all these sites have potential issues with them and arguments for and arguments against. And so that is all just by way of exposition. And as the other guys get, as we get closer, obviously, to Sinai, they are more than welcome to put forward those ideas. Scott?
There's even one out there that, when I first heard it, sounded completely crazy to me. But the more I think about it, the more I think it's probably likely, is that Mount Sinai, as it existed at that time, doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, yeah.
That either, because there's pretty good evidence that around 400 BC, there was a pretty major seismic event in this area, which also probably changes the Red Sea and the Reed Sea and all that mess anyway. But even beyond that, there's a lot of people who think, and again, it was pretty crazy when I first heard it, but that like the actual tabernacle, that if God had left, and very similar to the garden probably doesn't exist on this earth anymore. Translocated, beamed up, whatever you want to call it. It became part of the heavenly place. There's a lot of people who think Sinai was like that.
Right, yeah.
It literally, God caused it to cease to exist so people would not go there trying to find their way to a physical place that represents God.
Right. I would say that's just as likely as anything. If you know two things about Scott, he's into swords and beaming people up. Those are the two things he's into. So this is a good point. Yeah, good point by Scott there. So those are just some options for you. And again, I kind of think it's a fool's errand to try and base your whole life's work on that, but there are people who do it. With that being said, all right, let's get into a little bit of the initial journey here. So we actually skipped over this in light of the enormity of the importance of the topics that we were talking about previously. However, I want to look at Exodus 12:37 through 42, because this is really where the journey begins. And so the initial move is from the city of Ramses to the city of Sukkot. These are either cities or areas. Ramses was alluded to earlier in the book of Exodus in chapter 1, verse 11. And if it's the same place, Ramses was one of the places that the Israelites were actually building. Now that idea actually has some good merit with it, because that would indicate it's probably close to where they were. It's an area that they're familiar with. And you got to think, okay, the size, the number of people, they've got this large group of people that are gathered together, so they need a staging area, a large area where they can all gather, that they're all familiar with, to kind of launch off from. And so they have this place, Ramses there, that they kind of take off from, and then they move south or east over towards Sukkot, and move from there. Sukkot, again, likely south or east. Now, verse 37 reads as follows: "And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock." And it goes on and it gives some various details there that I kind of alluded to in previous classes. One of the things that I would bring to your attention is that this large group of people, so the large group of people that we have here that you see in this particular passage, 600 eliphs is the Hebrew word that is referred to here. So the word eleph there is a word that has a diverse number of meanings in the Bible. All right, so it's translated thousands on our side. I just want to make you aware of some other ways that this word is translated, and it's translated this way a lot in many biblical passages. I didn't even begin to put them up there. So it's translated thousands. It's translated cattle, as in a group of cattle. It's translated as clan, division, families, ox. And let me tell you what the idea. So typically the Israelites would have an ox with a group of cattle, and so just it became a stand-in for this amount of cattle, or tribes. So there's a huge variance in the terms and the meanings of exactly what this is. So you've seen a lot, I'm sure we've all seen the idea that, okay, this might be 2 million people. Well, it also might be the variance in the terms itself would also potentially limit the number to something much smaller than that, but still a very large group of people. And he also uses this term, and I've put the Hebrew up there, regeli. I'm not even going to pretend I know how to pronounce that. That's the Hebrew word that's for what follows in the rest of this. And basically it means something kind of like foot soldiers is essentially what it means. So these are the men of fighting age, 600,000 or whatever else, clans, divisions, squads, platoons, that idea, 600,000 of those of fighting men of that age, which would probably be between 20 and 50 years of age, obviously. And we get that from the idea of the time that the priests would serve in the tabernacle. So this is largely what it's referring to here, and this is the number of people that came out. So again, there's a huge amount of flexibility in the amount of people that is indicated in this passage. It may have been that big, it may have been smaller than that, but I just wanted to make you aware of the flexibility in the term. There's also this problem, as I alluded to, with the chronology. The chronology of the book of Exodus is largely based on several different passages. One is in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13, where God tells, that's in the passage there, where God tells Abraham that your descendants are going to be, they're going to be sojourners or slaves in a land that's not their own for 400 years. All right, so that's one way of counting it. So there's one passage. The other major passage that helps date the Exodus is obviously this one that has an indication of 430 years. Another one is in Galatians 3, 16 and 17, where Paul refers to this time from the time of Abraham as being inside the 400 years. So there's additional flexibility in that term. And then there's the passage in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, which is around the reign of Solomon, and it talks about a period of 480 years up to Solomon. Now, I say all that, again, I'm not going to get into the chronology of it, other than to just give you an idea how immensely complicated all of this is. The only thing that we really hang our hats on is people feel really good about the time frame that they know that Solomon reigned. So scholars generally agree about when Solomon reigned and around when he was on the throne, so then they try and work backwards from that. And all this leads into interpretations about which Pharaoh it was, Were the Hyksos involved? Was it after the Hyksos? Was that the Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph? Again, all extremely complicated issues that really shouldn't take up a lot of our focus, but I just want to bring them up to make you aware of the enormous complexity of these kinds of issues. So there's a lot more unknown, and I don't really think that's the point of the book of Exodus either, but just wanted to make you aware it was something that was hotly debated. All right, a couple other things here. We have in chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and verses 11 through 16, the law of the firstborn. All right? Now, why put this law here? Why here for all of this? Any ideas about that? Okay, all right. So, Steve says because God had just killed the firstborn of the Egyptians. Now, help me bridge the gap. Okay, but why, Steve? What does that have to do with the other thing?
That was what set them free. That was the last miracle. And so they need to concentrate. They need
Okay,
to pay it back.
so that's what set them free and consecrated them? Yeah, Mark?
The whole purpose for that miracle was to do what? Was to make Egypt understand who God is.
Okay,
And so I think in carrying forth that same idea, that
Right.
when they realize what God has done for them, he's asking for the same thing, the firstborn, so that they know who brought them from.
right. So Mark points out for everybody who couldn't hear that as we covered a lot in the previous class periods, that the plagues, and particularly that 10th plague, was for the Egyptians, but it was also for the Israelites, and so that they would know who God was and what he expected and what he demanded. And so it's a consecration to God, and that's the term that's used. Consecrate to me, meaning what? Consecrate meaning what? Set apart, set apart to me. These belong, implying that these belong to me. And of certain types, as you read later in the first part, in the back half of the instructions, certain types of animals and your firstborn children, you are to redeem. And then some of the you are to offer to God. Lambs always belong to God. Children you are to redeem. But of the first of everything belongs to me. That is mine, my right. I passed over your firstborn in Egypt, therefore consecrate them to me. They belong to me. There's also, so that's what I'm saying here. They tie to the connection that God had redeeming the firstborn, and therefore they were his. This also, so remember that the Passover comes at the springtime of the year, so it comes in April. So if you're of an agrarian mind, if you are thinking like a farmer, like somebody who keeps sheep, this is the time of year when the kidding, when the births of the new sheep, the new animals, this is when they were typically born. And so when, again, if you're thinking like the things to do around this time of the year, this is one of the things to do that happens every year at this time of the year. And so from an agrarian standpoint, it makes a whole lot of sense at that point in time in the year. Yes?
What about redemption?
Right.
You got redemption up here in this first one.
Yes, I did.
This is the pattern.
Yeah, right. This is part of the pattern that God had redeemed, and ultimately, that's kind of what I'm saying. So ultimately, they're going to be redeemed at the price of, thank you, I had this in my head, but I had forgotten it. Ultimately, they're going to be redeemed at the price of God's own firstborn. All right, thank you. I had that, but I forgot that. They're going to be redeemed in connection with God's own firstborn. And so he's going to give his firstborn for us, ergo, you deliver your firstborn to me. And so there's this there's this connecting and binding together of obviously what's going on in this covenant, and obviously the design that God has coming in the covenant to come. Any other thoughts or comments about that before we kind of move in?
Well, I think you touched on it, but you just can't overlook what it says, that the reason he's telling
Yeah.
what does this mean?
Right.
This is not one of those, I mean, I think you're right. I
Yeah.
do think firstborn and Jesus and all those things tied together.
Right.
But God explicitly tells us here the reason he made them do this.
Right.
It's mentioned in 4 different verses.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And I think that ties it back to what we talked about in the who was the Passover and who were the plagues really for.
Right.
You know, the Egyptians aren't going to remember 1,000 years later what was going on.
Right.
But every time they set apart the firstborn and someone says, what was this? They're going to remember the firstborn of everything of all time is going to be a reminder.
Right.
You know, why do we follow Yahweh? Well, because he saved us.
He did this. Yeah. Yeah. And it really is a powerful reminder. Yeah, I think personally about that. That's a good point. I think personally about when my firstborn child was born. If I had to do some kind of rite at that point in time to buy back Madeline, would have never forgotten that. Would have never forgotten that. Oh, yeah, I would remember the at.
No. I mean, Madeline is not a male.
Oh, yeah. True. Although, actually, that is how it worked out in practice. The term actually here is gender neutral. It did work out in practice to be firstborn, but regardless, if I had done it for Everett, the same. No less. Yeah, good point. All right. So then he goes on and he starts to take them down this journey. Now, in verse 17 of chapter 13, he says, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Now, why? Why? Now, God obviously could have wiped out the Philistines just like anybody else. So why are we not taking the most direct route here? He didn't want them to fear and turn back. And he obviously knows his people, and he knows that they're going to do that. And obviously, we know he needs them to go through some things. He needs some things. It's not just going to be the fast, easy path to get to the promised land. We're going to go through some things here. God has more of an elaborate design of showing the children of Israel above and beyond the acts that he's already done in Egypt to explain who he is, what the nature of their relationship is before they just walk into the promised land. And an integral part of that is introducing them slowly but surely to trusting God on the battlefield. And actually, that's one of the elements that we're going to see here in the Red Sea crossing. And in part of that, we see Joseph's faith goes right down to his bones. So Joseph had given instruction that he was to be carried to the promised land when the children of Israel were to exit. And in fact, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22 talks explicitly that by faith, Joseph had given instruction regarding his bones, that they would be taken with him because he knew that they were going to the promised land. So that faith that connected Joseph to them, it carries right on down. And so here you see them taking Joseph's bones. And this actually is a very important concept in the ancient Near Eastern culture. Where your bones were was typically where your family was. You were buried with the family. When we read, and he was gathered to his fathers, he was gathered to his people, part of the concept was not just the spiritual aspect of that, but also that his bones are gathered to the bones of the forefather. And so here you see Joseph wants to be with the people. He wants to go with his people because he knows the land that they're going to. Again, I come back to this idea of there's a land in the promise. It's part of the promised land. Joseph wants his bones to be there. And another important concept that is given to us right here at the end of chapter 13 is this idea of the pillar of the cloud and of the fire. So you'll see there, it represents, we'll read here real quick in verse 21 and 22 of chapter 13. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. And then let's skip over also into 14:19 to kind of string all the thoughts together here. And now it says, and now the angel of God. So previously it was the Lord, and now it's the angel of God, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and thus it was a cloud of darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. So the pillar of cloud and fire here is a symbol that we're going to see repeated in lots of occasions here in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well as it's a picture of what's going to ultimately be at Sinai. When they get to Sinai, the scenes that they see on Sinai are going to be repeated of the pillar of cloud and fire, and that's what's on top of the mountain. And it's symbolic throughout the scriptures of God's presence, okay? God's presence is typified in the very scenes that we see unveiled here kind of for the first time in the Bible. Anytime the day of the Lord is mentioned, God's judgment, all right, there are many days of the Lord, most all those times, you see that the Lord is coming in the clouds in judgment. And I'll give you some quick, Daniel 7:13, the Son of Man comes on the clouds. Matthew 24:30, Revelation 1:17 are just to name a few where God comes in the clouds in judgment. That's how he's pictured. And the darkness of the cloud, so we typically think about God being a God of light, but also there's this reference to the darkness of the cloud. And that also is a frequent picture that's given throughout all of Scripture. In Deuteronomy 5:22, there's a reference to this. In Psalms 97:2, we talk about the God who dwells in the cloud behind the darkness. These are pictures that God is establishing here in the book of Exodus that he's going to use throughout to picture who he is, all right? And there's this dual kind of thing that's going on that we see explicitly given in Exodus chapter 14. To the one, he's light. To his followers, to his believers, they see because of the pillar of fire and because of the brightness of the cloud. To everybody else, he obscures vision. There's an interesting, really odd, it must have been something to see. Whatever physically is going on here must have been just absolutely crazy to see. But the implication is that he's both light and dark depending upon your relationship to him and how he reveals himself. And he does this over and over again in the Old Testament. So we see, and we also see here, again, the synonymous nature of the angel of God and the Lord in these two passages used somewhat interchangeably. I know Scott had done a class on that not too long ago. Interestingly here also, most of the scholars agree that the Israelites only saw one manifestation of God. Either he was the cloud and the pillar, but some have debated the wording here and in verse 14 and 19 that they saw the cloud and the pillar, and they might have also seen a manifestation of an angel of God as well. So in either case, the most important aspect of all of this, and I think the one that we need to walk away with is, why is God doing this? We need to answer that question. Why do this? Why show up as a pillar of cloud and a fire? Other than the protection element. Protection element is one, but why do this? To lead them. Okay, so to lead them does what for them, though? Yeah, provides comfort, right? So this is part of kind of what we talked about in this last class period. Let's try and get back into the heads of the people who were living back then. What they need to understand is that Yahweh is a God that doesn't just have power in Egypt. He has power in the desert. He has power in the promised land, and he's going to walk them the whole way there. Because just like we had said before, the common assumption about the gods is that you're a god of this area, that area. Your reign extends here, but no further. Or you get weaker as you get further away from here. What God is showing in this passage is he's going to walk with them the whole way, and he feels like it is important to physically manifest to the people that they can look up and they can see, that's our God right there. He thought it was important that his people could be able to look at any point in time and say, that's a manifestation of our God right there, walking with us the whole way. That he's not abandoned them, that his power has not diminished, and that even though they're in the middle of the desert, that God is with them, and that he's not turned his back on them, and he has not become fickle or tired of them. And as what's interesting about that, so we think how great that God is there and they can physically see this cloud, right? But how quickly they grow callous to the whole idea. It's not going to be all that long from now where they're seeing all of this and they're making golden calves and rising up to play. And it's amazing how quickly it just wears off. And I think all of us think if there was just like a physical representation, if I just had the little angel on my shoulder all the time, that would really prevent me from falling into a lot of sins. And here's some people who had a giant billboard that was walking around with them, and they found it just as easy to sin. I mean, we all know logically that God is wherever we are and dwells within us. But it doesn't stop us from growing callous to that fact. And so it's just this interesting document, despite all the fact that all of what we know, all of how we've developed, the way that God now dwells with us, how even then it really wouldn't do you as much good as you think it would to a callous heart. To see the presence of God like that. It didn't for them, at least anyways.
I think there's an interesting parallel there in what the two representations, the fire and the cloud, you think about those are the two things that also protected them from the Egyptians.
Right.
The column of fire that came down to stop the army, and then of course the cloud of the Red Sea
Right.
protecting them. So that's an interesting constant reminder of that.
Right.
And the thing that I always think about when I try to think about how in the world could they have fallen so quickly, I think about even in the New Testament, the Pharisees, I mean, what did they say to Jesus? Just give us a sign and we'll believe.
Right.
You know, and that's just a thing that is carried down throughout. And I think God is trying to, when we talk about the Old Testament being a tutor and trying to teach us to a place, I think he's trying to tell us today, as Christians in the new covenant, that yes, it's not going to be one where you're running around doing miracles and I'm constantly there. This is in your heart. This is a matter of faith. Because even when these people had it,
They didn't. Yeah. And the one that sticks with me, I think different ones stick with different people. The one that sticks with me is the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Send somebody back from the grave. Surely they'll hear him. Oh, the irony of saying those words before Jesus is about to die and be resurrected. Oh, the irony of that situation. No, if they won't hear the prophets, they're not going to hear if somebody raised from the dead, meaning they're not going to hear me, Christ, when I raise from the dead, and they're not going to hear the apostles when they say he's risen from the dead. And so, to your point, it just goes all the way, but human nature has not changed and will not change absent the indwelling of the Spirit in each and every one of us. That is the changing factor. But absent that, humanity really is no different than they were at the Red Sea crossing. And I think that's the exact picture of it there. In Exodus 14, 1 through 9, we see Pharaoh's going to make some really poor decisions, aided by God. So Pharaoh, obviously, they're not that far out there. So he's probably got people that are out there saying, hey, the Israelites are out there just floundering. And what there's really going on in these first few passages is God is speaking to Moses, and he's telling Moses, this is what's going to happen. All right? So Pharaoh believes that God is kind of a poor general. He's a poor leader. He was great for him when they were in Egypt. Now he's got him out there in the desert, and he didn't know what he's doing. He didn't know where he's going. And any possibility, from Pharaoh's standpoint, any possibility of quickly building back the economy depends upon having a quick, vast labor supply that they just lost. They just lost their primary and chief abundant supply of labor, and now it's gone. And so if you're ever going to be, the economy and the nation of Egypt is just decimated. And so if you're ever going to be able to build back, you got to get these people back. You got to get your workforce back. And so what we see in verses 1 through 9 are them kind of saying to each other, what are we doing? We see in verse 5, why have we done this, that we have let Israel go from serving us? And so you kind of see they come to this realization, like, we've let go the main asset that we had. All our other assets are gone. We got to grab them back. And so we also see in this passage that God now wants to show his superiority in battle against the army of Pharaoh. So in this passage, we see that Pharaoh gathers together his chariots. So we see he takes 600 choice chariots and some captains, so some personal choice men, and the Lord hardens their hearts. And we're going to see here in a little bit how hard their hearts were. Chariots were really advanced weaponry at this point in time, so they would have been very effective, certainly in the terrain that Egypt normally fought in, but they're not going to be so effective here shortly. So in Exodus 10 through 14, we see that Moses shows his leadership and his faith. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched toward them, so they were very afraid. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, let us alone? But Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. So Moses here understood the words of God in the first few verses of this. He believed them down to his core, and is now really, not to say up to this point he hasn't been showing his leadership, but now when it appears like that it's an impossible situation, that there is nothing to do. And it's clear that Moses had no idea how God was going to get him out of this situation. They got terrain on this side, the sea on that side, chariots in front of them, and Moses has no idea how God's going to take him out of the situation. But even though all he can look around and see are those circumstances, he knew and believed and represented to the people that God was about to deliver them out of what seemed to be an absolutely impossible situation. And so he says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Now, I'm going to do this in reverse, and I did this on purpose because I knew it was going to be this way time-wise. So we all know, and we'll talk in just a second about what the parting of the Red Sea is. But what does it mean? What does it signify? What is the parting of the Red Sea in the larger biblical story? It's a picture of salvation, is it not? It is a picture of God fully redeeming and buying his people. Turn over real quick to 1 Peter chapter 1, 20 through 21. I'm convinced that this is a typology of something that we see all throughout the scriptures. And it's a typology of several different types. And we see this connection with water. Talking about Christ's suffering, he says, who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. There's an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of filth of the flesh, but the answer of good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There is a passage through water that saved Noah. And there is a passage through water today that now saves us in the sense that Peter is given here. Water crossings of this type are a type that can be found all throughout the scriptures. And I'll give you some examples of them. But they mean a cleansing from something old, a removal of something old, a creating of something new. Something old goes into the water, something new comes out. And the waters themselves prove to be a path of judgment through which refinement and through which this process of creating something new occurs. And let me give you some examples of this, because there's a bunch. The flood, which I just used here. Something old was buried in the watery grave in the flood, and something new came out the other side, and the means through which that judgment occurred is water. The Red Sea crossing, the Jordan crossing. God's going to say the exact same kinds of things when the children of Israel are prepared to go into the promised land. He's going to lead them in by placing his ark into the waters of the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan are going to stand up, and they're going to come through a new people. In fact, on that day, they named the city on the other side Gilgal, because that's the day that God says, I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you today. It's an exact picture. Naaman's baptism, the cleansing of something old, something new comes out of it. Decrepit, old, nasty flesh is driven away, and new flesh that's like a baby's is what comes up out of the water. You might remember from Elijah and Elisha. Elisha knows that Elijah is about to be taken up into heaven. Prophets have been telling him all day, you know your master's going to be taken up into heaven today. I know, I don't want to talk about it. That's the whole way there. They go across the Jordan, and he asks for a double portion of Elisha's spirit, that the Spirit of God would rest on him doubly the way it rested on Elijah. And he gives him his cloak, and he comes back. Now, and this one really has a lot of pictures to it. He comes back. Remember, at this time, Ahab's ruling. It's like Canaan all over again. Elisha smacks that water, walks right through it to try and conquer the land again for God. Same kind of thing. A man named Elisha walked across that water. But when he came back the other side, it wasn't the same man that went through on the other side. It was something new. It was something completely different. Jonah went down into the watery grave inside the whale, and what got spit up on the other side of that land was somebody willing to go obey God. John's baptism. Think about Jesus's, when that was his announcement. Think about the people who were coming out to be baptized by John. And they were saying, what do we need to do? What do the soldiers need to do? What do the tax collectors need to do? Dead people were walking out to John trying to find out, how do we live on the other side? And then ultimately, this is obviously a picture of our ultimate Christian baptism, where something new comes out of something old, where something is refined through water and comes back. And I alluded to, there's another picture here out there that means, I alluded to this before. God conquers chaos by acting on the sea. This happens all the time in ancient Near Eastern culture. This is one of the things I alluded to some number of classes ago. In Genesis 1 and 2, in verses 9 and 11, God's Spirit is hovering over the face of the waters. And he separates the waters and brings land up out of the waters. He parts what the ancient Near Eastern religions knew as the chaos gods, the sea which cannot be tamed. And here's God taming the sea and bringing something new up out of it. He's literally creating dry land where there was no dry land before. In Psalm 74, 12 through 17, there's a passage there about God taming the sea beast and giving it to all the lands of the people. That actually is a passage that is commonly known in the ancient Near Eastern culture, but it's attributed, that act of God taming the Leviathan, the sea beast, is God taming the chaos gods. Gods that all the other nations of the world would have thought were unconquerable. The sea is not conquerable. It can't be tamed. And of course, the ultimate version of this is Jesus calms the sea. He's the one who steps out, was asleep, and ultimately conquered the chaos that was the sea. And so we see, and man, we're going to run out of time, but 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. That's the passage that talks about, and we mentioned this previously, how the children of Israel were all baptized into Moses and immersed into the sea and into the cloud. And they were initiated into, that means simply that they were, think of it as being initiated into the religion of Moses, the one that he's going to mediate. All right, and it's done through these methodologies of the cloud and of the sea. All right, so they're brought into this idea. But the warning in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is that those same people, just like we talked about a second ago, those same people who saw those things, God was displeased with most of those folks, and their bodies were strewn across the desert. And these things are written for our understanding. That's the point in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. I hate to run through all that real quick, but the actual passages here in Exodus chapter 14, 15 through 31 are some of the most significant portions of Israelite history. It's recorded twice here, once in poetry form and once in prose form. So all of Exodus chapter 15 is, of course, a poetry version of what we read in Exodus chapter 14. God is a hedge for Israel all night as they cross. And an east wind creates two walls. That word for wall is the exact same word that they used to describe city walls. This was a big moment. It wasn't a marshy area. It was walls, like city walls that they passed through. And the Egyptians follow in close behind only to immediately recognize and to state overtly, Yahweh fights for them. Now you see how demented, how hard-hearted they were. How hard-hearted do you have to be separated by a wall of cloud all night, and then to follow these people into the middle of the sea, and then to realize God fights for these people. And they were swallowed up. They were washed away, and the Israelites who came out on the other side were a completely different kind of people than the kind of Israelites that walked in on the other side. This is another class we probably could have done two on, but we're going to go from here and take over. Scott, is it you next time or is it Jay?
No, it's me.
All right, Scott's next time. We'll pick up right there. Thank you all very much.